All right, guys, here we go. We're on our second video here. We're going to talk about chapter 21. We're going to talk about periodization. So we're about to get into a couple videos and PowerPoints. All the PowerPoints should be online, so if you're wanting to look ahead and kind of, read up on for your own sake, and then use my videos as kind of a filler, if so to speak. Okay. We're about to start getting into all the programming aspects. So the stuff that could be useful for your programming portion of the projects that we have at the end of the semester. So what we're going to do is we're going to understand the central concepts that underpin the periodization of training, appreciate the value, role, and application of periodization, and describe the 4 periods of the traditional periodization model. Describe the 3 phases of the preparatory period of the traditional periodization model, relate the 4 sports seasons, and apply the program design variables to create a periodized strength training program. So it's not just, let me throw out these exercises, let me throw out these number of sets, number of reps, because that's what I felt like when I woke up this Monday morning. No, it's a science to it. And even then, that science becomes a little bit of an art form when we really start to look at it. And if you'll notice, or if you have any type of understanding of different athletics, especially even at, let's take the collegiate level, our beach volleyball team is not doing the exact same thing that the football team is doing. Well, why not? I mean, they're both trying to gain the same thing, right? Well, it's different. You have to relate it to sport. You have to relate it to what needs of the team, what time periods do the teams have, okay? And we're going to learn about all that. So what is periodization? Essentially, periodization is a theoretical and practical construct that allows for the systematic, sequential, and integrative programming of training interventions, into mutually dependent periods of time in order to induce specific physiological adaptations that underpin performance outcomes. The short of it, basically, it's a theory of how we section out our program to gain certain aspects without overdoing one particular aspect over the course of the time. For instance, and we'll learn about it, if we were just to do strength-based work, working on strength for the whole time, we lose aspects of muscular endurance, muscular power, muscular hypertrophy. Okay, you want a sequential or put those into an order and a system that helps build upon each other. That way it's an overall and all-encompassing type of a program. So we need to know about the general adaptation syndrome. So there's an alarm, there's a resistance, there's an exhaustion, and one of the foundational concepts from which periodization theories have been developed. When I go to the next slide, I think the next slide is the picture of it, you'll understand what we're talking about when we start talking about periodization. Oh, well, here we go. So essentially what's happening is, if we start here, let's just say right over in here, this is where we start. We come into the gym day 1. That's our baseline level of performance, okay? We're going to start introducing stressors. The training and the workouts are the stressors. The exercise is the stressor. And what starts to happen is our performance level will go down, all right? The way I like to describe this, well, first off, number 1 is the alarm phase. There it is. It's the initial phase of training when the stimulus is first recognized and performance generally decreases in response to fatigue. Think about the last time that you really started and you went into the gym for the first time, or if you remember when you're back in athletics, and maybe it was right after summer, right? You don't really do much maybe during summer. What happens? You think you're at a certain performance level, and then we start introducing the workouts, and it seems as though, wow, it's kind of hard. I'm not able to do what I was able to do a couple days ago because I'm fatigued pretty quickly. That's the point, right? What we should see is this go from point 1 to point 2. There's this resistance phase. It's that second phase in which adaptation occurs and the system is returned to baseline, or in most instances above baseline. So we're elevating your performance level. That's the whole point, right? You want to get better and better. So what happens is you should start to see this increase where now the stuff that I originally asked you to do is becoming easier. So what's happening? We get to point 3. That's that super compensation. It's basically our new level of performance. It's our new baseline is what it is. Notice how it's higher than that of where we started. And then what's going to happen is we introduce new stressors. In other words, we get to a point in the program where maybe we need to introduce something more. Maybe this whole first time it was 3 sets of 10 at a certain weight. And we'll understand all that here once we get through these PowerPoints. Now we're going to go and let me restart. Let's say the initial thing we did was 3 sets of 10 at 50% of your 1 rep max. Okay. Well, essentially what we're going to do is when we get to this new baseline, we could retest. We could if it took us that long, okay? And now if we say our 1 rep max increases, well, technically if we kept it at 3 sets of 10 at 50%, that 50% is higher or heavier, more intense than the original 50%, right? So we would see it happen again. And we would bring it back up to where, again, we hit a new phase. Do it all over again. So what you're wanting this to happen with periodization is you want it to be a stair-step mode, okay? That's what we want. But if we start to introduce stressors that are too exhausting, in other words, way too much to where the person can handle and the adaptation is not going to occur, we start to see this shift in this portion number 4. That's that overtraining. If our stressors are too high and we don't have the proper recovery or anything like that, what's going to happen is overtraining syndrome can result. And essentially what's going to happen is you'll never get to this point. We essentially need you to stop training and allow for you to recover properly to get maybe back to this, if that. And then we start the phase all over again. And what you've done is you've lost a lot of valuable training time. So we have that stimulus, fatigue, recovery, adaptation theory, an extension of that general adaptation syndrome, suggesting that the training stimuli produces a general response. Well, yeah, the greater the overall magnitude of a workout, the more fatigue that accumulates and the longer the delay before complete recovery occurs so that adaptation can occur. Hence why we don't sit there and do a all-out leg day on Monday and do all-out leg day on Tuesday, all-out leg day on Wednesday. Your body's not going to have enough time to recover, right? So we have to start, and we'll start learning about that in programming. You have to start putting things together in a manner where we allow for the body to adapt and recover from itself. That way, those new baselines or those new levels of performance can be reached. So this is what we're starting to see. We start to see that training stimulus occurs, right? And what happens? We start to fatigue. It'll fatigue the body. Even if we started putting in like dashes through here that said days, yeah, you're going to be fatigued. Just remember the first time you started working out or you come back off of a long break, yeah, stuff that you originally were able to do, it becomes harder. But then all of a sudden what happens? You recover, right? And now we've hit this point now where we can overcompensate. We can change the stimuli. And guess what? It's easier. Why? Because now we've hit a new level of training. And then we go and we do it all over again. All right? That's what we're talking about. That's the importance of periodization. The fitness fatigue paradigm. Every training bout creates both fitness and fatigue, which summate to create preparedness. High training loads result in both elevated fatigue and fitness levels. Low training loads result in minimal fitness or fatigue. So inherently, they can be combined together. You know, we may have high training loads for a long period of time that's going to put a lot of fatigue and stress on the body, but helps us to increase those fitness levels. Well, then at the very end, let's say we do 3 weeks of high level. Let's do a week of low training, right? We're not going to get a lot of fitness out of it, but we're also not going to fatigue ourselves, so we can put a lot of recovery aspects into that and get us ready for that next level of high training loads that we're going to be doing. And then the fatigue dissipates faster than fitness and therefore allows for elevated preparedness. Again, you're going to get rid of that fatigue a lot faster than your fitness levels, as long as you remain active, are going to remain there for quite a while longer. So if we look at this and we look at our preparedness versus our fatigue versus our fitness, as we can start to see, if we start training this, look what starts to happen. Everything starts to come in where everything equates, but where we're wanting it, okay, that preparedness optimizes fatigue, dissipates at a faster rate than your fitness. Now we're ready to compete or test or whatever it might be. So it all follows that same aspect. So some of the key terms that we have when we start talking about periodization is we have a macro cycle, a mesocycle, and a microcycle. So the way this definition says is that it's an entire training year, okay, for a macro. Actually, you can put a macro into whatever it is, as long as you incorporate the fact that a macro is your starting point all the way to your end point. That's a macro. Meso are the sections in between. So let's take it from this aspect. If we said that we have a 16-week macro cycle, every 4 weeks may be a mesocycle, all right? So the ones that are a couple weeks here and there. And then our micro cycles could be our changes daily or our weekly changes within those 4 weeks each and every time, okay? So as long as you understand that it's macro, meso, micro, okay? For periodized training plans, we systematically shift training foci from general non-specific activities of high volume and low intensity toward activities of lower volume and higher intensity over a period of many weeks or months. So if we're not even talking, because strength and conditioning is not always just the weight room, okay? It can be stuff that's more sport related as well. Let's think about it this way. Think about any of you that are athletes currently, or remember those of you that are not current athletes when you used to play, okay? How did it look in the preseason? Things were very high volume, but the intensity was pretty low, right? To kind of get you back into the rhythm. And then there's a shift and it starts to become, maybe a medium volume, medium intensity. And then once we get started closer to the season, it's a lot lower volume. So maybe the repetitions are down, but each and every time that you do that repetition, it needs to be at a high intensity, right? To get to the most work out of as little tax on the body as you can. That's what we're doing to make sure that we optimize our performance capacities. So if we look at it this way, the volume in training. So if we look at it with volume of training, the intensity versus the technique of the training, okay? So when we get into it, it may be that we don't do so much volume. As you can see, it follows this where volume is the highest in that prep phase, and it starts to transition down when we get into that competition-based phase, right? Okay, when we're looking at this dotted line being where we want to peak at the most important time. Maybe that's the championships, right? Or playoffs, okay? So what happens is that volume starts to go down, meaning the amount of times that we're training maybe decreases to where that intensity starts to increase, meaning, yes, we're going to be training at a lot less, so the quality needs to be up or increased. But look what also starts to happen. Your technique starts way down here, meaning at this very beginning portion, we're more worried about just getting training in. We don't even care about your technique. You can even substitute technique for sports specificity. right? So if we were to look at it, and we'll start to learn the definitions of all of these down here, but what we're going to see is that all of a sudden, if we're going to start decreasing the amount of times or the training that we're doing, look what needs to increase: our technique. So it needs to become more technique based, and the intensity that we work with that technique needs to increase as well. Okay, to where when we get to that point where we're trying to peak, it's all technique and intensity, not necessarily a load or a volume. Okay, so that preparatory period, that's going to be that initial period, is usually the longest and occurs during the time of the year when there are no competitions and technical, tactical, or sport specific work is limited, also known as the off season. Okay, so we talk about off season, and it's typically viewed as, okay, well, once let's take it for instance, the Super Bowl goes in, we're in off season. They call it the off season from the time the Super Bowl ends to essentially when we start preseason training camps. Actually, the off season is a much shorter period. It's typically a period that more of the emphasis is established of a base level conditioning to increase the athlete's tolerance for more intense training. And what we're going to see is that some of these things are actually periods that aren't what we typically view as an off season. So there's going to be a portion or a phase that we go through that basically work is decreased in effort for rehab and recovery. All right. But the preparatory period is the off season. So let's think about that as when you start going through your off season training. So typically football does off season training in the spring. Okay. That's when we're going to be working more along. We don't care about the sport specific aspects of it. We're looking at more along the lines of, during this time, I'm ready to get people stronger, maybe faster, more powerful. Maybe someone wants to get more muscle mass, so we're going to include more hypertrophy aspects. Or they didn't feel like their endurance was there, so we're going to work on their endurance during this time. So that way, when they come into the season, it's at a higher level than it was the previous year. We can have a hypertrophy and a strength endurance phase, so that we have low to moderate intensity. So it's 50 to 75% of that 1 RM at high volumes. So 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 20 repetitions. Along with a basic strength phase, we have a high intensity. So it's 80 to 95% of the 1 RM, and can moderate to high volume. So 2 to 6 sets of 2 to 6 repetitions. All right. Obviously, if you're doing a lot of stuff where it's heavier, you might want to decrease the number of sets a little bit. Okay. And we'll start talking about all that moving forward. Then we have what we call the first transition phase. So it's a linkage between the prep and the competitive phase. Classically, the resistance training in this period focuses on the elevation of strength and its translation to power development. We have what we call a strength and power phase. So there's a load of very high loads, anywhere between 30 and 95% of the 1 rep max, depending on which exercise. So if it's a more power-based exercise, that's going to be on those lower percentages, because technically power-based exercises require the most technique. And then the strength exercises are going to be those heavier percentages. In low volumes, so 2 to 5 sets of 2 to 5 repetitions. Then we move into what we call our competitive phase. This is for peaking athletes usually use very high to low intensity and very low volume, meaning that there's not a lot going on, but the intensity that they work at is at a higher level. And typically during competitive phases, we're looking more along the lines for maintenance. Athletes use moderate to high intensity with moderate volumes. So if you're looking at athletes that are trying to peak at different times, maybe it's for track, those individuals are trying to peak at different points. So their stuff is going to look a lot different than say, a football program or even a baseball program or softball, whatever it might be, once you move into the competitive phase, the amount of times that you're actually working out and doing this type stuff goes way down. Okay. We're just trying to somewhat maintain some levels of stuff that we built in the off season and in that prep period. And what's happening is we're trying to make sure that everybody is staying as healthy as possible. Okay. And more of the work during this time becomes more technique based. Okay. Or sport specific. Then we have the second transition period. So this is that portion that I'm talking to you about. So you have your competitive phase and it ends. Let's say it's the championship of your season, and it ends. Okay. Then we have to have a certain time period, and that's the second transition period. That's active rest. Basically what it is this is when all your athletes are supposed to start doing rehab, because we have a lot of nagging injuries that we just try to, lack of better term, band-aid up, right, during the season to help them perform. This period is the time in which they use to get those injuries, rehab them. Some of them have surgery during this time. Basically, it's to refresh the body mentally and physically in prep for us to get into that next off season. Okay. If we start to skip this too much, or we shorten this period to be too small, this is when we start to see those individuals that start to suffer from things such as burnout or overuse injuries, particularly. Why? Because they've never given the body enough time to rest. They go straight from that high level of performance during competition, and then they go straight into their off season of training, and that body never gets a time to recover. Okay, so the adaptations, while yeah, they might be able to make a few, maybe they're not to the level that they were able to had they given themselves the proper rest. Now, if we're starting to apply the sports seasons to the periodization periods, off season, that's that prep period between the end of the postseason and the beginning of the preseason. So typically it's about 6 weeks, although it varies greatly. Let's think about it this way. On a typical non-quarantine, non-coronavirus year, what does the NBA do? Think about it. The NBA, I believe their championship is typically mid-June, typically, right about there. Don't quote me on that. But then they're already doing preseason work in September, just about, if not early October. So that means July, August, and maybe September, portions of September, you have to fit in that active recovery phase and an off season to get them prepared for the next season. That's pretty short period, guys. So the types of stuff, if you were to sit there and say, oh, I come from a football training background, it might not translate over to basketball because you don't have the time for that, right? Not to mention you have portions of their competitive season where what are you really supposed to do? Do you really have a lot of practice in the NBA? Considering that we play Monday night, come back and play again on Wednesday night, travel, come play again on Saturday, right? The seasons are different. Football is I play Sunday or Monday, or if we take college, I play Saturday, play next Saturday, right? There's a lot of time in between their competitions. So you got to understand that this shifts based upon the sport or the activity that you're using. The preseason leads up to that first contest with a focus on the strength and power phase of the resistance training. We want to get that as high as possible. That way, once we get into that maintenance phase, we're not losing a lot of that strength and power throughout the season. In season contains all the contests scheduled for that year, including any tournament games. Most sports have a long season that requires multiple mesocycles around key events, which is true. Maybe it's you have a certain type of training or goal in mind for baseball, who, once again, on a normal year, let's take Major League, you start in April, and we're just trying to get to the All-Star break, which is in July. All right, halfway point of the season. That's what we may be trying to do. We're trying to do something in that time that, yeah, we're trying to win games. We're trying to do the best that we can. But what's really important is that from the All-Star break afterwards, when the final push of the season. So what are you doing to make sure that your athletes are at their highest, or at least maintain it? Because 162 games a year, including with all the travel, that's a big tax on the body. And then that postseason, after the final contest, active or relative rest for the athlete before beginning the next year's offseason and preparatory period. Here's another thing that you need to think about. I just discussed that of the NBA, okay? How their championship is in mid-June, and they start practices and stuff in September again. That's for those that are in the finals. What if your team's not good enough and doesn't even make the playoffs? Your season's over in April. So inherently, sometimes, weirdly enough, why they don't become better because they have more recovery time. But you may have teams that end their season a lot earlier. Okay. So you may be planning for everything to start at the championship. But if something goes on and your season ends way too early, you need to have a plan in mind that helps cover all that. Or let's sit there and say, you're like, you know what, man, I'm part of the Cleveland Cavaliers. There's no way we're making the playoffs. I'm starting our program here. Okay, now all of a sudden, LeBron comes back. Oh, we're going to be in the final. So now I've got to shift everything, right? So it can't be that you just put all your stuff into one basket and that's it. There's no shifting. Because with periodization and sports and everything else and training, you have to be willing and able to change things sometimes on the fly. So if we're looking at it, annual training plans, if you look at our macro here, the macro cycle, so again, it's the beginning to the end. We look at it, we have our prep period, that's the off season. During that time, we're looking at hypertrophy, basic strength, hypertrophy and power, basic strength, okay? Then we get into the preseason, that's strength and power, basic strength, okay? In season, it's all maintenance, and that kind of depends upon what your idea of maintenance is. Typically, it might just be, your more basic exercises and 1 to 2 days a week of getting the body moving and maintaining some sort of activity. And then we have active recovery in that postseason. So some of our key terms, you can do what we call linear periodization. That's a traditional resistance training periodization model with gradual progressive mesocycle increases. So it may be that it says we're going to do 4 sets of 10 at 50% for a week. Week 2, we're going to do 4 sets of 8 at 60%, 4 sets of 6 at 70%. That's linear, so it follows the same trend. And then what we'll do is essentially we get to a point at the end of a mesocycle and we drop it back down and we start again and it follows a curve again, all right? Or you have an undulating. That one may be where it's, all right, week 1, you're at 4 sets of 10. Week 2, you're at 4 sets of 6 at a higher percentage. Week 3, you're at 4 sets of 10. Or you may go Monday, 4 sets of 10. Wednesday, 4 sets of 6. Friday, 4 sets of 8. So it's constantly moving. It's also known as wave periodization. So if you want to look at an example of an annual training program, kind of here's the basic breakdown. And then it'll go through. I've also got some stuff that I'm going to put onto Blackboard, I'm not going to talk about all this. You can read this portion and kind of put it together. But I've got some pictures on Blackboard that I'm going to send out, or at least upload onto Blackboard, that kind of breaks it down, and it does it in a couple different ways. It takes you through different phases that this individual is going to go through, how they set up the exercises, their sets and reps, intensity percentages, and a little bit of it you'll be able to look at and you'll say, okay, I understand that, but you don't understand certain other pieces to it. That's okay, because here in the next couple of videos, we'll start talking about the theories of programming, and some of that stuff will start to make more sense, okay? All right, so that was periodization. That's going to be kind of your background into how you want to set everything up. So that's going to be your big picture. And then when we start talking about the programming, that's what's going to start bringing in everything and allowing us to understand the shifts of sets and reps and types of exercises. How we order the exercises makes a big difference in a lot of stuff as well. How we go from strength to power, from power to hypertrophy, and so on and so forth. So with that being said, remember, please make sure you get in touch with your groups. And if there's any questions, please email me, guys. That's our biggest way of communication right now. And if we need to, we can set up a class Zoom meeting. So in other words, we can interact via video like this. But I need y'all to contact me and let me know if we need that, all right? If that's all, be on the lookout for the next video. Have a good one, guys.